G'day guys, ZiggyD here. Recently I achieved the dream. I reached level 100 in an action RPG with a Thorns build. Grim Dawn was really the perfect choice to achieve this ultimate meme because Retaliation actually has excellent support in the game as a viable choice. And the game's vast and, most importantly, effective defensive mechanics makes for a really rewarding experience in making a tanky character in hardcore. It was a bit slow going at times on this build, and total playtime ended up being about 2.5 days to reach 100, which is slow by some Grim Dawn's players' standards, but this playthrough to 100 was actually super fun and memorable. See how much chunk of XP we get here when if we do. I don't actually know if you get more. Oh! Holy shit! It got us the rest of the way! At this point, after several hundred hours of softcore Grim Dawn, I had a decent handle on the mechanics to attempt a serious hardcore 100 push, and that made all the difference when making sure I was prepared for some of the challenges Grim Dawn throws your way. A lot of what will kill you in hardcore and Grim Dawn is simply not knowing how a mechanic works well enough, or being unaware of critical information regarding a certain threat. For example, that a rare arcane affix on hero monsters has the ability to turn off all your auras. That can really catch you off guard if you're not prepared. I have to credit my livestream chat as well for saving me a few times from some mistakes. Like, for example, don't piss off the avatar of Mogdrogan when you talk to him because he'll destroy you. I probably would have done that. We did have a few close calls. Often they were getting overwhelmed by a nasty pack of hero monsters in the Shattered Realms, which have proven to be very deadly. But the closest was probably facing the Mad Queen in Ultimate difficulty, which was a bad call to even begin with. She's an angry lady. I'd managed to kill her in a previous difficulty, but she's something else in Ultimate, and I would certainly recommend avoiding until you're well prepared. Damn, she spams those projectiles. What the hell? I'm guessing my hammers are proccing them. Maybe disabling the hammers would be a good idea for this fight. Woo! I think that might have been a cheat death proc just now. Disabling the hammers would be a good idea for this fight. Woo! The only time I was truly defeated in this run was actually at the hands of the council members in Port Valbury, one of the roguelike dungeons. I think it's going to be surrender time, guys. At low life, these guys have a healing ability on a long-ish cooldown, and I simply just couldn't kill them fast enough, and they kept healing, so I had to leave. It hurts. Yeah, no, we're not going to make any progress on that. All right, I quit. But we did come back the next day with a few gear upgrades and refinements to the build to get our revenge in a truly epic gamer moment. We're doing it! We're doing it! We're doing it! We're doing it! I already went over the build for the most part a bit back at level 50, so you could check that out if you're interested in some more backstory. But I'll give a bit of a rundown here again now that I'm level 100, along with some thoughts and tips I've learned from the push to 100. So this is a Warlord, which is a soldier and an Oathkeeper, focused on using retaliation damage to kill enemies that attack you, as well as skills that get added damage from your total retaliation stats. There are a number of other ways you could build a retaliation character using different class combinations, though Warlord has plenty of support and is likely the tankiest of all the options thanks to Soldier's strong defensive options. Retaliation in Grim Dawn simply deals damage to melee attackers. Most enemies in Grim Dawn will at least do some melee attacks, though there are a few that only cast spells or use ranged attacks predominantly. Ranged attackers aren't too much of a problem because we have several other layers of counter-attack style procs that trigger on being hit or blocking. However, pure spellcasters, especially ones that use dot or ground effects, and mostly tanky boss versions of these, are definitely the biggest weakness of the build, as we have to rely almost entirely on dealing damage directly ourselves, which is not a lot, at least in my playthrough so far. Eventually, it could get really strong with the right items and the right setup, but for my push to 100, some of these tanky spellcaster boss fights were a little slow. Righteous Fervor and Aegis of Men here both have options to add your retaliation damage to their normal damage, so that helps, but they don't really get strong until you can get items that add extra retaliation to these skills. That's when they start to get the big damage. For most of the playthrough, our longest fights were always those spellcaster bosses, and that's just the weakness of the build in the end, until you can get some high-end gear that solves that particular problem. And that's usually the case in action RPGs, you know, all builds will have some sort of weakness until you can get certain items or a certain setup that solves that problem at least most of the way. Defensively speaking, however, this character has it all and does insanely well against just about anything the game can throw at you. And almost any other build I could have been playing probably would have died several times whenever I had some of those near misses. So it was ultimately the perfect character for me to get my first level 100 on as a result. So the defenses come in several layers, and I'll give a bit of a run through because defensive mechanics in this game are actually really interesting. Firstly, defensive skills and procs are super strong in Grim Dawn and essential for all builds. There's cheat death style heals, like Menhir's Wheelin Soldier of course, that activate when you drop to low health, which is your sign usually that you need to back off. If that procs and it's healed and it's on cooldown, yeah, it's time to run away for a little bit. But also skills like Ascension from Oathkeeper and Overguard from Soldier allow you to face tank most things thanks to the insanely strong mechanic Damage Absorption, which is just incredibly powerful in Grim Dawn. Defensive ability, or DA, is usually a bit of a priority for most builds and one of your first lines of defense. DA basically helps you evade and lowers your chance to be crit. Get enough of it and you won't ever be crit. The more the better with most builds, with a goal of something like 2,500 to 3,500, roughly in that range by endgame. That's like level 100-ish. Usually you get this through physique and stats on gear that add to defensive ability, and that's usually a priority. However, in this build, I don't actually focus on it that much because we get enough through raw physique. I already have, within that target range, and we actually want to be hit reasonably often, so best not to go overboard. Just getting the basic amount that we kind of incidentally get in this build is enough to never be crit, and we get hit like 80 to 85% of the time by most attacks, so it works reasonably well. Armor in this game is, however, actually super strong and important. Having high armor items and armor scaling, along with increases to armor absorption, the trifecta there, allows you to mitigate huge amounts of physical damage, which is the most common damage type in the game. Armor just works in this game. If you have 3,000 armor and 100 armor absorption, and you take a physical hit for 3,000 damage, you'll take exactly 0 damage. It's your first line of defense and works in conjunction with other defenses to bring incoming damage down to manageable amounts. The most important thing with armor is just to remember that if your items have started lagging behind your character many levels, then their armor values are probably quite low, and since hits are locational in Grim Dawn, so if you have a pair of really old gloves and then you get hit in the hands, then your armor on that particular spot on your character is going to be pretty weak, and you'll probably take a lot of damage when you get hit there. So it can be important to keep in mind if you've got weak areas on your character that you could be hit in, and try and shore those up if you are lagging behind a bit, if the item's not super essential and could be replaced with something maybe not as mechanically strong but has higher armor, sometimes that can be worth it. Resistances, as in all action RPGs, are always important, and there's a lot of them in this game, and it can be overwhelming for new players, but it's also way easier to get resists in Grim Dawn as well, especially later on in the game. You don't need to cap all your resists early on, but it does help to be mindful of the certain damage types you'll be facing, and say you're heading into an area with a lot of Aether damage, maybe doing some gear swaps or some component swaps to give you some Aether resistance can be very helpful. Gear can have a lot of resists on it in this game, and keeping an eye out for rares with 2 to 3 or even 4 good resistances goes a long way, especially if those are harder resists to get, like Aether and Chaos resistance. Components help a lot in the early game, and you'll want to prioritize resistances in your component slots for the most part until you get them capped. Check the blacksmith for resistance components you can craft as well, because there's quite a few in there that won't actually drop that you can craft, like things that give lightning resist, fire resist, and cold resist, as well as purified salts for Aether resist. Eventually, usually by the time you start ultimate difficulty, you'll get your faction reputation up to a point where you can solve resists mainly through augments from the faction vendors. These allow you to put some extra resists on most of your gear pieces and helps a lot. Once you start getting those augments, you can start swapping your components to more offensive or other forms of defenses that your character needs. Capping resists and increasing the cap is big, and as you can see, I'm running pretty respectable resistance totals. I've got a few items that increase my maximum caps, as well as some passives. Late game overcapping resists to deal with resistance lowering effects, kind of like curses in Path of Exile, is also a good idea where possible. Having like 20 to 30 over resist as a bit of a minimum long term is very helpful. Block is also quite strong in this game, and we scale it in this build both for offense and defense. Offense because blocking procs my Hammer Throw Devotion Targo's hammer, as well as some other retaliation skills, like Counterblow from the Totally Normal Shield weapon, which I showed how to get in my last video if you wanted to check that out. Blocks are good for defense because block outright mitigates a flat damage amount based on your damage blocked value. And in Grim Dawn, shields can block any damage type except damage over time and ground effects as far as I'm aware. You'll want to scale up all three aspects of block in a character that's getting block, and any character that can use a shield is going to benefit from it. Block chance, block recovery, and damage blocked are the trifecta there. Currently, as a baseline, with just my regular auras active, I can block 77% of hits with a cooldown of 0.4 seconds, and each block currently mitigates 3,500 damage. And that's without the Overguard skill from Soldier active, which brings the damage mitigation up and lowers the cooldown rate to 0 while active, so I can block everything as long as it hits that block chance. Physical resistance is a somewhat hidden and very powerful stat in Grim Dawn as well. It's easy to miss that it even exists. It happens after armor and simply mitigates a percentage of the remaining physical damage. I have about 40% of my character, so if 1,000 damage made it through our armor after getting mitigated by that, then that gets cut down to 600, so obviously that's quite powerful. And then absorption is your last line of defense and one of the most powerful, especially because it comes last in the order of operations. You can get percentage absorption, but the real meat is flat absorption. Both Ascension and Overguard have flat absorption, and you can alternate these skills. They both have 20-second cooldowns and 10-second durations, so you can keep one active at all times. The Stoneform Devotion from our Devotion tree also gives some block-triggered absorption as well that's up fairly often. As flat absorption just outright mitigates damage, and since it's the last in the defensive order of operations, the already armor-mitigated resistance-lowered damage is brought down to a pretty low number. So for example, a hit for 7,000 physical damage gets blocked, lowering it to 4,000, mitigated by armor, bringing it down to 1,000, mitigated by physical percent resistance, bringing it down to 600, mitigated by percentage absorption, bringing it down to 500, and then it meets my flat absorption of 150 from Ascension and 350 from Stoneform, bringing it down to 0. So a 7,000 physical damage hit will get brought down to 0. So that's why as you watch the footage, you'll often see me just taking no damage at all. What little damage does make it through these lines of defenses, we have a pretty large health pool to be able to absorb to prevent any sort of one-shot situations, which aren't as common as in Grim Dawn as in other action RPGs. But that's, if you actually put some attention into your defenses. Regen and hopefully a little bit of life leech on our meager attacks top us back up pretty effectively as well. Even a tiny amount of regen or leech goes a long way to keeping you full when you have this much mitigation, because if only a couple hundred damage is making it through, then a couple hundred regen per second heals you back up in a second. And that's just what I love about Grim Dawn's defensive mechanics. They layer, they work as you would expect, and they're very rewarding in the actual real-world scenarios you face in-game, not just theoretically. And in the slower pace of this game, you have time to see your defenses working and time to react if things get too spicy. Though it's not going to be everyone's favorite playstyle, the game suits a retaliation build brilliantly because of this. Gearing this build has been pretty relaxed. I didn't really get any big items, nothing crazy, or even any sets until the last few levels, where I managed to put together a halfway decent Retaliation 4 set and find a Bramblevine shield which adds some retaliation damage to one of my attacks. And my gear is actually still pretty average overall. There are some pretty beastly legendaries that you can find from 94 and onwards, but those aren't necessary to reach 100. I did it without, obviously, and it was only those last couple levels that I actually had some decent gear. Your priorities in gearing resistances is number one. Those are the most important thing to make sure they get capped first, and then you can kind of start to worry about other stuff. If you can survive, then you can get more gear to improve the other aspects of your character. We're talking hardcore here, of course. That increases to retaliation damage, percentage scaling, and flat added are both important. You'll get to a point where percentage scaling ends up giving you a lot more damage than flat added, so keep an eye on that, which one's more impactful for you at which times. It actually doesn't matter too much what retaliation damage you get in this build, because most retaliation scaling affects all types, and this one doesn't really do anything with specific retaliation types. Some builds will though, like acid retaliation builds, will really want to focus on that. Bonuses to certain skills that influence retaliation and add counter-attack style effects are also pretty high priority as well. Whenever you can get an extra counter-attack proc, it's pretty impactful on your character. The most impactful skill bonus effect you can get on gear are added retaliation damage to Righteous Fervor and Aegis of Menhir, followed by bonuses to Ascension and Counter Strike, both of which are very powerful skills. After that, block stats, life, armor are the things you should be looking for as well. Damage scaling, which is something you'd want in most builds a decent amount of, like for example increased physical damage, doesn't actually work for retaliation damage itself, but it does work for retaliation damage that's been added to your attacks and then dealt with that attack. So if you have added physical retaliation damage to an attack and then you get percentage increased physical, your Righteous Fervor that's dealing that damage as a regular attack damage will get scaled up. So ultimately they're relatively low impact, but long term can be helpful for being able to up your directly dealt damage. I'll link in the description my Grim Tools upload for my skills, devotion, and current gear as of level 100, so you can see a snapshot of my character as it was. If I were to continue the character, I'd be looking to refine things by adding more retaliation damage to attack skills and scaling that up a bit more, as well as getting some offensive ability because mine's woefully low, so I can actually hit and eventually crit with my attacks. At the moment, my direct damage output is lacking, let's say. But I ultimately did make it to level 100 just fine, letting enemies mostly attack me and kill themselves through retaliation and counter procs, and it worked reasonably well. I got here after all. So that's my update on my level 100 Retaliation Warlord. It was quite the journey. There's a ton I could do now at 100 to make this character actually super powerful. Like, I think the high end for this is really high. But ultimately I ended up farming a lot of cool gear for other builds. So next time I play Grim Dawn, I might be starting a new hardcore build. Maybe Doombolt or Panetti's replicating missile, which I found some cool items for. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or thoughts, or if you just want to share some Grim Dawn stories of your own. Also, if you don't yet have Grim Dawn, consider checking it out. It's a fantastic action RPG with a very different playstyle to Path of Exile, while still being quite meaty in terms of its depth and mechanics. And it's also available in my official game store if you'd like to support me through purchases made there. Anyway guys, that's it for now. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.